Kicking off June's news, we start in Northern Ireland, where anti-immigrant protests would take place across several towns over multiple nights. The protests first took root in the town of Ballymena on the 7th of June, after a pair of teenagers were accused of sexually assaulting a local teenage girl. Speaking through a Romanian interpreter, the pair both pleaded not guilty to the charge of attempted rape. On the 9th of June, a vigil was held in support of the victim, and police present would initially describe the group as peaceful. Later that night, however, a masked breakaway group would begin to attack police and houses within the area. The rioters would throw bricks, bottles, and Molotov cocktails at police, who would respond by firing baton rounds and making arrests. Rioters also set fires to homes and cars in the area, which spread to a home where a woman and 2 children were hiding. It appeared as if some of the people involved didn't get the entire point of a peaceful protest advocating for the protection of children. The next day, residents began hanging the Union Jack or flag of Ulster from their front windows to discourage the rioters from attacking their houses. If the rioters are mad at immigrants, this shit might as well be a magic anti-sea bear circle. At one point, a rioter attempted to throw a Molotov but ended up setting himself on fire. Here's evidence of the incident that will make historians in the future wonder why we were so addicted to making any real-world footage entirely unwatchable.
What the fuck is this piece of shit?
On the third day of unrest, the police requested assistance from Great Britain, which was provided in accordance with their mutual aid agreements. Demonstrations by this stage had spread to other towns across Northern Ireland, such as Coleraine, where a railway line fire would lead to the cancellation of train and bus services to the town. Elsewhere in the town of Larne, a leisure centre was being used as a shelter for displaced persons from the 2 previous nights of rioting. The centre would later be set on fire, forcing 100 people to evacuate. By the 17th of June, the unrest seemed to fizzle out, and as of time of writing, 31 people have been arrested by local police. Getting to the core of why this wave of unrest got started is fairly difficult given the circumstances, but the 2 main concerns seem to be that migrants have been breaking the law, and that they've been a burden on Ireland's welfare system. On the crime front, this part was an absolute bitch to research, as we couldn't find any data within Northern Ireland which specifically recorded incidents where migrants broke the law. This data gap also extends to Vanilla Ireland, which also doesn't record detailed demographic data when it comes to crime reporting. However, according to the nation's Central Statistics Office, there has been no noticeable increase in crime due to the rise of asylum seekers. Swag spent around 90 minutes trying to find something better than this, but Ireland's stats game is kinda lacking. The public welfare angle was a lot easier to find data on. Asylum seekers entering the UK are entitled to be given a place to stay when declaring their status. However, they don't get to choose where. On top of accommodation, asylum seekers typically get an allowance for food and other basic goods, which typically amounts to around £50 per week. Asylum seekers aren't given priority for access to social housing programs. However, they're treated the same as Irish citizens when it comes to assessing housing needs. This, in itself, hits on broader economic issues within Northern Ireland, including rising costs of living, housing shortages, and a cutback on social welfare spending. As sociologist Ruth McCarravey would explain, there is a level of discontent that the people are taking to the streets. The lack of those resources does not help for the incorporation of different social groups into society, and to help achieve social cohesion. People feel they're not in control and things are happening to them, as opposed to a more natural, organic change. A silver lining to this most recent wave of unrest are reports that Catholic and Protestant relations have been somewhat strengthened, as rioters of both sects put aside their differences to light buildings on fire. However, what we know is that the protesters don't necessarily represent the views of a majority of Northern Ireland's residents. The Northern Ireland Life and Times survey found that 94% of respondents would be willing to accept a person of a minority ethnic group in their area, up from 53% 2 decades ago. Although immigration to Northern Ireland is much higher than what it once was, statistics show that it's by far the least diverse part of the UK. 3.4% of Northern Ireland's population identifies as part of a minority ethnic group, compared to 12.9% in Scotland, and 18.3% in England and Wales. On the 21st of June, another protest took place in the city of Belfast, seemingly in opposition to the ones that originated from Ballymena, with organisers stating that the march was to show solidarity with migrant workers and refugees. As one attendee speaking to the BBC would explain, quote, "We are disgusted violence against women and girls is being used in this way." This most recent bout of unrest has very closely mirrored a previous wave of protests within the UK last year, which was sparked after a British British citizen from a migrant family killed 3 children in Southport. Much like what we recently saw in Northern Ireland, the initial vigil was likewise hijacked by violent elements, and the following week would see 1,200 arrests and over 100 injuries. This isn't even our only story this month, which is related to immigration policy, so viewers should probably expect this to be a mainstay of the series going into the future. In the meantime, here's a goofy old-timey ad that somehow got through the vetting process.
If you've got a bad case of cabin fever, or just caught plain old spook's disease, you might be looking for a helpful Charlie to give you a leg up in life. Lucky for you, dear audience, today's sponsor, Surfshark VPN, can be the miracle solution for your every problem. Think of Surfshark as your best pal, your good time boy, and your mysterious masked avenger. While you're tapping away on that newfangled webinet, Surfshark is in the back room, punching malware, kicking fishers, and giving online trackers the old 1-2 skidoo. You don't want to end up like old Swag. No, sir. Poor fella got hacked by the Ruskies a few months back, and it's been a real humdinger of a headache trying to get his ducks back in a row. But wait, there's more. With Surfshark, you can sidestep region locks slicker than a con man at a county fair. That means no more missing out on your favorite pictures just because the old Netflix and Prime Video decided to be no good Nellies. No more reining in on this parade, Mr. Bezos. This time, the piss bottle's in the other glove. And here's the real kicker, folks. By heading over to surfshark.com/SirSwag, using the code SirSwag, or zapping that newfangled QR doohickey on screen, you'll get an extra 4 months absolutely free. That's right, free! And if it still ain't up to snuff, you teeny boppers and wife swappers can cancel within 30 days and get your dough back, no questions asked. It's as easy as pie and twice as sweet. Surfshark VPN. It's thrifty, it's young. It'll make you want to come to your senses and seriously reconsider your online privacy.
Meanwhile, the Louisiana House of Representatives passed a bill to ban chemtrails. An AI company worth $1.5 billion actually turned out to be 700 Indians in a trench coat. And a dictator who caused some of the world's highest levels of inflation blames gay people for the nation's falling birth rate. In what is perhaps the biggest surprise of the month, the United States isn't taking up the majority of our runtime. But that doesn't mean the nation wasn't busy. Protest was the word of the month over June, which kicked off with the anti-ICE demonstrations in LA on the 6th. We've already made an entire video on this one, so we won't go too heavy into the details. But here's a short rundown for those who missed it. The whole thing started when immigration raids targeting workplaces took place over LA. Despite these raids reportedly detaining less than 50 people, an impromptu protest would break out the same day, and would quickly grow to thousands over the following week. President Trump had long campaigned on heavy-handed immigration policies leading up to his second election win. Many of the attending protesters had become particularly concerned with the methods used when carrying out arrests and deportations of undocumented immigrants. In particular, the use of masked law enforcement officers using unmarked cars has struck a chord with many of those demonstrating, as they argue that it can be difficult to differentiate between being detained and being kidnapped. There's also been the deportations to El Salvador's infamous Secot prison, which led to at least one US resident to be sent there without a trial. Once again, we've already made videos on both the ICE protests as well as a bigger look at US immigration as a whole, so we won't dive into these topics too much. However, to keep a long story short, the protesters felt that the Trump administration had become too authoritarian in its policies. This probably wasn't helped by the president's reaction to the protests, who would go on to send 4,000 National Guards and 700 Marines against the wishes of California Governor Gavin Newsom. It was also the perception of increased authoritarianism and democratic backsliding which would lead to the subsequent No Kings protest, which would go on to be the third biggest in US history. Unlike the previous ICE protests in LA, this new round of demonstrations was the result of a lot more organization, being put together with the help of over 200 coalition groups of broadly progressive conservative organizations. When we spoke to one attendee of both the ICE and No Kings protests, they would comment that the No Kings rally seemed to generally be an anti-Trump rally. In their own words, quote, "Early on, the ICE protests felt a little disorganized. They were kind of just there protesting, but it didn't feel angry the way it does now. Some friends of mine are there pretty often, and they've said the second Trump got involved, it basically supercharged the protests." Talking about the No Kings protest a few days later, they would comment, quote, "A lot of the protest felt anti-Trump and anti-ICE, but the emphasis was felt on Trump in my opinion. A lot of the anti-ICE chants didn't get as much traction as the fuck Trump ones." Perhaps most importantly, they would also comment, "I was not able to get a picture of them, but I am on my hands and knees asking you to add this to your video if you can find the image." Some dude was holding a "Don't Deport Latinas" sign, and it had Shadow the Hedgehog. Although we couldn't find the sign either, here's a mock-up we made in all of its glory. On the very same day as the No Kings protest, President Trump was attending his own event in Washington, a military parade commemorating the nation's 250th birthday. Although planning for the event had begun in 2023 as a Flag Day celebration, the circumstances surrounding the event would put career sitcom writers to shame. During his first presidency, President Trump initially wanted a military parade after watching France's 2017 Bastille Day celebrations. However, former four-star Marine General and then Defense Secretary Jim Mattis stated that he'd, quote, "rather swallow acid than have the parade." Meanwhile, Air Force General Paul J. Silver commented that military parades are what dictators do. With this in mind, a key characteristic of the second Trump presidency has been the president's diligence in replacing key figures in the government with people who share his grand vision. The last military parade conducted by the United States was the 1991 National Victory Day celebration, to celebrate the conclusion of the Gulf War. A fun coincidence of this month's parade is that it also coincided with the 79th birthday of President Trump, which makes the entire situation so fucking funny. Just imagine a demonstrator going out for a rally specifically because they think President Trump is becoming too authoritarian. They then come home, turn on the news, and see the president seemingly host a military parade for his birthday while saluting tanks rolling down the streets of DC. This shit is the absolute peak of comedy. In all fairness to the parade, however, it appeared to be much better than Russia's parade last month, which made use of CGI and reused aircraft footage from the previous year. The latest round of protests are an interesting case study in how the nation has reacted to the gradual changes made by the Trump administration, and how they're perceived differently by different people within American society. Supporters of the president see immigration officials just doing their job by deporting people who are undocumented. Meanwhile, his detractors view the recent arrests as one step away from deporting US citizens to a hellish super prison. Likewise, supporters see the military parade as a patriotic way to support the army and celebrate America's birthday, while detractors think it just makes the president look more like a dictator. As President Trump is only 6 months into his term, we'll likely be covering similar stories like this until at least 2028. Until then, if you'd like to watch our deeper coverage of the ICE protests, or delve further into US immigration as a whole, links to those will be down in the description. Moving on to technology, and House Republicans would slip a surprise provision into the president's big beautiful tax bill, which would ban state and local governments from regulating AI for the next 10 years. The ban specifies that neither state nor political authorities can enforce laws regulating AI models, AI systems, or automated decision systems. This means that AI's usage in business settings, research programs, public utilities, institutions of education, and within the United States federal government could only be limited at the federal level. House Republicans and AI technology representatives such as OpenAI's CEO Sam Altman argue that the complete degradation of AI lawmaking will pave the way for technological development at an increased rate. Specifically, they reason that if the US-based artificial intelligence development is too heavily regulated, this could put America at a disadvantage against Chinese AI efforts. US tech companies are currently investing insane resources into AI-based technology, as the potential applications of AI could stretch stretch to reach every industry in every country on the planet. For example, Microsoft recently signed a deal to lease a previously closed nuclear power plant for the next 2 decades, purely to generate enough power for its own AI ambitions. Artificial intelligence is seen by many as the space race of our time, which is why these aforementioned House Republicans view it as critical for American AI dominance. Critics, on the other hand, including many fellow Republicans, believe that such an insanely powerful technology could be incredibly dangerous without regulation. You've probably already seen hundreds of AI-generated videos and images online, and compared to just a few years ago, the technology has managed to improve at a rapid pace. We've already seen AI software used for political slander, such as this video shared by Elon Musk in July last year. It's easy to argue that this was clearly a parody, but it just shows how easy it is to abuse AI tools and spam out a wave of disinformation to flood elections. I mean, Swag made a video with AI where Omni-Man explains progressive income taxes, and he's basically considered technologically illiterate among the news team.
Well, research into experimental death lasers and CIA-backed coups aren't cheap, you know.
Wait, what?
It just highlights how easy these AI tools have become. Leading up to the 2024 election, US intelligence agencies would warn that Russia, Iran, and China had all been using AI tools in an effort to influence the American public for their own interest. According to US intelligence, Iran focused on content related to Israel's war with Hamas. China wanted to sow division with key issues like immigration and abortion, and Russia pushed to get President Trump re-elected to ease pressure in its invasion of Ukraine. An entirely unregulated AI industry could theoretically lead to a situation where leaders aren't chosen by their values or policies, but rather how effectively their AI algorithms can flood voters with propaganda. Cambridge Analytica was basically doing this shit 10 years ago, and that was without being supercharged by AI. This doesn't even touch on the myriad of other concerns related to AI, such as the huge threat it might pose to millions of jobs, and how it could potentially cause extreme spikes in unemployment if measures aren't set up to support industries affected. Even in our case, we got comments all the time that we're using an AI-generated voiceover. Comments such as, "I was fooled by the title of this video, thinking that it would actually be news without the bullshit. Yet this was little more than the same kind of garbage mainstream media puts out regurgitated through a crappy AI voice." A pessimist might view the AI provision as a concession from the Trump administration, in exchange for the support of various tech leaders in the run-up to the president's second term in office. During President Trump's inauguration, tech moguls such as Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, Tim Cook, and Sundar Pichai were all in frame next to the president, and all donated to his inaugural committee. An optimist, however, might see the AI provision as one of the many things that lawmakers sneak into the large bill before it gets passed. Georgia Congressman Marjorie Taylor Greene would be one such lawmaker who claimed to not know about the provision after she voted in favor of the bill. In all fairness, however, Greene has previously subscribed to QAnon and Pizzagate conspiracy theories, and has repeatedly posted Russian propaganda since its invasion of Ukraine. We suspect that asking her to read anything might exceed her current abilities. During the month of June, House Republicans would implement slight alterations to the AI clause. Instead of outright banning state and local governments from regulating the AI industry, it would instead allow the federal government to deny federal funding for large-scale broadband coverage. As of time of writing, the Big Beautiful Bill has passed through the House and is on its way to the Senate, so we won't know for sure how much these provisions will be modified by the time they reach the president's desk. The debate around the use of AI and the government's role in regulating it will likely be written on some of the most impactful pieces of paper of our time, so it's likely we'll be feeling the effects of these decisions for decades to come. We now get to the biggest story of the month, the recent conflict between Israel and On the 13th of June, the nation of Israel launched Operation Rising Lion, a large-scale synchronized strike on more than a dozen locations and cities throughout Iran. The attack would primarily target military installations, nuclear sites, and the nation's prominent military leaders. Iranian state media would go on to report hundreds of fatalities following the attack, including civilians and children. The operation is now considered the largest attack against Iran since the Gulf War. Before we get into how the attack happened and what it might mean, 2015, we're going to do our best to set the stage for why Iran and Israel are currently at odds. We've obviously had to trim a lot of the fat here, but here's a very condensed history. When Israel was established in 1948, the nation would go on to have a fairly close relationship with the Iranian government. A big contributor was that in 1953, the CIA and MI6 backed a coup against Mohammad Mossadegh to secure oil interests in the region. The intervention would lead to the rise of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who, although ruled as a dictator, oversaw a golden age for Iran's economic growth. His reign would see an unprecedented period of modernization within Iran, decades of double-digit GDP growth and huge strides in education and urbanization. However, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi's rule was also incredibly oppressive, making use of secret police, rigged elections, and a strict one-party system. By the 1970s, Iran had serious problems with wealth inequality, inflation, unemployment, and housing shortages. More importantly, Pahlavi's close relationship with the West hadn't been sitting very well with the nation's religious leaders, who felt that Iran's westernization was contrary to traditional Islamic values. Sprinkle in foreign-owned control of Iran's oil resources and some incredibly violent crackdowns, and 1979 would see the birth of the Iranian Revolution. The monarchy would be replaced by a religious theocracy. Islamic law would substitute the old secular legal system, and a lot of the previously westernized culture within Iran would be outlawed. Iran essentially replaced its Western-backed oppressive dictatorship for a homegrown Iranian oppressive dictatorship. Following the revolution, many Western nations, including Israel, viewed Iran as a rogue state, and ended up hitting the nation with a large cornucopia of sanctions and embargoes. In fact, before Russia even decided to launch its invasion into Ukraine, Iran was the single most sanctioned country on Earth. Much like a typical League of Legends player, the Islamic Republic of Iran has long had a problem with making friends. Iran obviously wasn't keen on close relations with the Western world, but the Shia-Sunni divide also meant it was difficult finding allies within the Middle East. This has meant that a lot of Iran's recent allies have been friends by circumstance, or proxy militia groups that Iran funds and trains. Unfortunately for Iran, recent events have seen this list of allies rapidly start to shrink. Russia is caught up in its own war, the Assad regime in Syria was overthrown late last year, and Hezbollah got its leadership decimated by Israel in last year's short-lived incursion into Lebanon. With all of this in mind, we also need to look at Iran's nuclear program, which is a big piece of this puzzle. Iran's nuclear ambitions first kicked off in the 1950s with the help of the United States. After the 1979 revolution, this support obviously stopped, along with Iran's nuclear program. Sometime during the Iran/Iraq War in the 1980s, Iran's nuclear program would once again continue in secret. And considering the nation's relationship with most of the world, this started making a lot of other countries pretty nervous. Iran's nuclear program would lead to thousands of sanctions being imposed upon it over the following decades, and numerous infamous attempts to sabotage Iranian nuclear refinement. Such cases include 7 separate assassination attempts of nuclear scientists and engineers between 2007 and 2020, which weren't officially carried out by Israel, but they were probably carried out by Israel. A joint US-Israeli hacking campaign would also cause serious setbacks to Iran's nuclear ambitions following the infamous Stuxnet hack in 2010. Fast forward to 2015, and the Iran nuclear deal would be signed. An agreement between these nations to ease sanctions pressure in exchange for the winding down of Iran's nuclear program. The deal would be nuked by the Trump administration in 2018, with President Trump calling it the worst deal ever. Critics of the deal would state that although it stopped Iran from attempting to refine weapons-grade uranium, it didn't stop Iran from funding and training regional militia forces. At the time, President Trump stated that America's new maximum pressure campaign would force Iran into accepting a better deal. However, no new deal has since been signed. Since the end of the Iran nuclear deal, Iran has supercharged its nuclear program, and by 2023, the International Atomic Energy Agency reported that the nation's stockpile of enriched uranium was 22 times over the limit previously set by the deal. In our research, we found conflicting statements regarding US intelligence for Iran's nuclear program. In a statement presented to Congress in March this year, America's Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard stated, "The IC, intelligence community, continues to assess that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon, and that Supreme Leader Khamenei has not authorized a nuclear weapon program that he suspended in 2003. President Trump this month month would later state that his intelligence community was wrong on Iran's nuclear capabilities, which would spur Gabbard to comment, quote, "The dishonest media is intentionally taking my testimony out of context and spreading fake news as a way to manufacture division. America has intelligence that Iran is at the point it can produce a nuclear weapon within weeks to months, if they decide to finalize the assembly. President Trump has been clear that can't happen, and I agree." This was a little confusing, but if our Year 10 reading comprehension skills are to be believed, it seems as if US intelligence didn't believe Iran was making nuclear weapons, but had the capacity to do so if it wanted to. President Trump tends to be quite ambiguous in the way he talks, so to be entirely honest, we have no fucking idea. What we do know is that he was convinced enough to take direct action against Iran later in the month, but we'll get to that in a bit. With that enormous lore dump out of the way, we now come to the events of this month. The initial attack on Iran saw Israel employ over 200 aircraft to strike 100 sites across Iran. The US-manufactured F-35s were supposedly even modified prior to the operation to include larger fuel tanks, which allowed them to strike further without having to refuel mid-flight. According to Israeli officials following the attack, the operation against Iran had taken several years of planning, and even involved them secretly setting up a drone base just outside of the Iranian capital of Tehran. Before the main attack, these drones were set to take out a number of missile systems situated around Iran, which made way for the main force from Israel. Israel's intelligence agency Mossad has gained a reputation of pulling off seemingly impossible operations with a combination of genius-level planning and brutally ruthless efficiency. In 2020, they managed to assassinate an Iranian scientist with a remote-controlled machine gun, and only last year they infiltrated the supply chain of Hezbollah's pager supplier before detonating thousands of them simultaneously. In the direct aftermath of Israel's strike on Iran, the US human rights activist news agency would report roughly 400 dead, with around half being civilians, a quarter being military personnel, and a quarter being unidentified. This number is likely much higher by the time this video goes live. Following Israel's attack, the Iranian government promised a harsh response, which was soon followed by a flurry of drone and missile attacks targeting cities within Israel. A resident of Tel Aviv reached out to us following the attack, and would express their frustration at the Israeli government for not doing enough to provide adequate bomb shelters for the nation's population. Much like most people who we speak to in the region, they seem much more concerned with the well-being of themselves and their loved ones than worrying about why their government had decided to bomb another country. Due to Iran's internet blackout and harsh censorship laws, we weren't able to get in contact with anyone within the country. Like pretty much all conflicts of this nature, misinformation quickly spread to all major social media platforms. Personal favorites of ours was the AI-generated picture of a shot-down F-35 with the most fucked up proportions you've ever seen, and a plane crash that any 10-year-old with a PlayStation could call out as fake. Internationally, Israel's strikes on Iran have been a mixed bag. Russia, China, and a swath of other nations across the Middle East and Africa have condemned the attack. Meanwhile, nations within the EU were generally much more supportive. President of the European Commission Ursula von der Leyen would comment, "Iran is the principal source of instability in the Middle East, and that the same type of Iranian-designed drones and ballistic missiles are indiscriminately hitting civilians in Ukraine and now in Israel." Meanwhile, Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz would comment that, "This is the dirty work that Israel is doing for all of us, and that the Iranian government had brought death and destruction to the world." Meanwhile, Iran's Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei would comment that the Zionist regime prepared itself for a bitter and painful fate. The Iranian public were a bit more split, however. Following the strikes, thousands would rally in Tehran calling for retaliation. Some carried portraits of Qasem Soleimani, a figure who was considered a national war hero before he was assassinated by the United States in 2020. Other Iranians were celebrating the strikes on high-ranking military personnel, viewing the attacks as a blow to key figures holding together an oppressive regime. Speaking to NPR, a 50-year-old Iranian woman living near Tehran commented, quote, "When I heard the news, I lost my control and was shouting, thanking Netanyahu for killing these criminals. We have not heard any good national news for many years. For once, war news made us slightly happy." The BBC would also manage to get in contact with a handful of Iranian citizens who expressed their own thoughts on the strikes. A 27-year-old named Seema would comment, "I wish Israel would get the job done as soon as possible. I'm exhausted, although I'm still not a fan of Israel or what it's doing. I hope they'd finish what they've started. Wishful thinking, I know, but I want them to rid us and the world of the threat of the IRGC. Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and Ayatollahs as a whole. Meanwhile, a 23-year-old named Amir said that he was entirely supportive of Israel's strikes, stating that no one had been prepared to take on Iran's authoritarian government. As he explains, quote, "Not the UN, not Europe, not even us. We tried, remember? And they killed us in the streets. I'm joyful when the people who've crushed our lives finally taste fear. We deserve that much." Amir could have been referring to the 2019 protests, which Reuters estimated killed 1,500 people. Alternatively, he could have been talking about the 2022 Mahsa Amini protests, in which over 550 people were killed after a 22-year-old woman didn't wear a hijab properly. Other Iranians were much more jaded following the violence, such as 22-year-old Azur, who commented, "I hate the regime and I hate what it's done to us. But when I see bombs falling, I think of my grandmother, my little cousin, and I've seen what Netanyahu did to Gaza. Do you really think he cares about Iranians? This isn't about us. This is about Israeli politics. I feel like I have to choose between two evils, and I can't. I just want my people to be safe. I want to breathe without fear." Azur's comments about Gaza were particularly relevant, as this month saw 59 Palestinians killed via tank fire while trying to recover food from water and aid trucks. Israel's devastating military campaign into Gaza has been a damning talking point among human rights activists the world over, as even conservative estimates place the death toll above 50,000 in less than 2 years. An ongoing international criminal court case is currently determining whether Israel's military campaign into Gaza constitutes a genocide. However, such cases usually take years to reach a conclusion. With this said, they say that your best friends will always love you unconditionally, and Israel has no better friend than the United States. Reports indicate that the United States knew about Israel's attack on Iran at least a week beforehand, but that's all we currently know. The two nations have a long history as extremely close military allies, with Israel acting as a key regional foothold within the Middle East. The relationship is so tight that Ukraine has complained on multiple occasions that military aid intended for the war against Russia routinely gets rerouted to Israel. Commenting following Israel's operation, President Trump called for Iran's unconditional surrender and stated, "We now have complete and total control of the skies over Iran." Both the US and Israel value their air superiority as a key pillar in their military doctrines, which allows air assets to have free rein to basically hit whatever targets they want. However, one of the silliest parts of this entire conflict is that Israel used US-made F-35s to take out Iran's F-14s, a fighter jet that was also made by the United States and sold to Iran before they had their big falling out. Out of a war between Iran and Israel, Lockheed Martin wins again. A decent amount of our writing time was spent on speculating whether the United States would take a more direct role in offensive operations against Iran, a question which would actually be answered before our cutoff date for once. On the 22nd of June, the United States would launch Operation Midnight Hammer, which aimed to take out the three key nuclear facilities of Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. The mission would start in Missouri's Whiteman Air Base and would involve 125 military aircraft, most notably B-2 Spirits. Just the fact that America whipped out the B-2s was the first clue that Uncle Sam wasn't fucking around. Only 21 of these things were ever made. America has never sold them to anyone, and their cost per unit is estimated to be $2.1 billion each. Supposedly, operating costs are $150,000 for every hour they're in the air, and with the B-2s flying around for roughly 37 continuous hours during the operation, they must have racked up quite a tab. It should be noted that although 7 B-2s traveled across the Atlantic to Iran, a decoy force would be sent over the Pacific. This enormous mobilization would mark the largest strike using B-2s since they were introduced in the late 90s. Most notably, they were equipped with JBU-57 bunker busters, bombs so heavy and enormous that B-2s are literally the only aircraft in service that can drop them. The bombs themselves weigh 13 metric tons, and their sheer weight is designed to penetrate up to 60 meters into the ground before detonating its timed 2,400 kilo payload. 14 of these bunker busters were dropped on the Fordo nuclear enrichment facility, which is a really big deal. The operation marked the first time the bombs have ever been used in combat, and although we don't know for sure, some estimates place America's entire stockpile of the bomb as low as 20. Experts state that these bombs are the only thing on Earth that could have conceivably destroyed the underground facility. The operation also employed 12 dozen cruise missiles launched from a US submarine, as well as a preceding force of 5 fighter jets to make sure the bombers had a clear run. With this in mind, the jets received no such resistance during the operation owing to Israel's previous strikes a week earlier. Following the strike, Iranian officials would state that the nation didn't suffer a serious setback, claiming that the nuclear material had already been moved. According to the UN's nuclear watchdog, there was no increase in radiation levels following the attack. Iran would then go on to fire missiles at US bases in both Iraq and Qatar. Meanwhile, in the United States, President Trump reported that the attack caused
massive damage.
In terms of what the endgame strategy could be, Vice President J.D. Vance stated that a regime change was not the goal of the operation. This would almost immediately be contradicted by President Trump, who in posting on Truth Social stated, "It's not politically correct to use the term regime change, but if the current Iranian regime is unable to make Iran great again, why wouldn't there be a regime change? MEGA." Why anyone feels the need to fabricate news for clicks is a compulsion beyond our understanding, especially when the real world is genuinely this goofy. Within the United States, the strikes were quite divisive even among the president's supporters. On the campaign trail, President Trump frequently rallied against what he called stupid, endless wars. However, as we mentioned, he's long had a pretty strict hardline approach when it comes to Iran's nuclear ambitions. The president's Republican allies have been split into two main camps when it comes to the most recent conflict. On one hand, you have the hawkish Republicans who argue that crippling Iran's government is in the best interests of the United States. A notable voice from this camp is South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham, who commented, quote, "President Trump understands the threat the Ayatollah presents to us, not just Israel, and that he will, at the end of the day, help Israel finish the job." The other camp are the isolationists, who generally prefer the United States to keep to itself and not get involved in conflicts outside its own borders. One such isolationist was the president's former political strategist, Steve Bannon, who stated, quote, "If we get sucked into this war, which inexorably looks like it's going to happen on the combat side, it's not just going to blow up the coalition, it's also going to thwart the most important thing, which is the deportation of the illegal alien invaders who are here." Other members of Congress have argued that as the strikes against Iran constitute an act of war, and as the president didn't get the approval of Congress before launching the operation, the mission itself was unconstitutional. However, as declaring war seems to be old-fashioned at this point, it might be hard to argue that in court. US Democratic Representative AOC has even floated the idea of attempting to impeach President Trump. However, Swag has promised to shit in his hands and clap if this ends up happening. On the night of the 23rd of June, President Trump declared that Iran and Israel had agreed to a ceasefire. However, when the media caught up with the president on the White House lawn the next day, it was clear that the peace process was proving to be more turbulent than what was hoped.
We basically have two countries that have been fighting so long and so hard that they don't know what the fuck they're doing. Do you understand that?
In all honesty, this was one of the hardest stories we've had to cover in a long time. The events from June moved so quickly that we've had to rewrite huge portions of the story nearly every day. During our coverage of this story, we've seen conflicting reports within the US government of the extent of Iran's nuclear capabilities, the goals of the US government, as well as the effectiveness of the American strikes on Iranian targets. Unfortunately, there's still a lot we just don't know at this point. Our cutoff for the writing portion of our production schedule was on the 26th of June, so unfortunately, anything that happened after that point hasn't been included. If this conflict continues in any meaningful capacity, we'll be sure to come back to it in next month's episode. The invasion of Ukraine has now rolled into the 4th month of its 3rd year, with Russia kicking off June with their invasion of the Sumy Oblast. Although making some gains initially, Russia's offensive was halted by the city of Sumy, and Ukraine has now managed to take back a portion of the lost territory. On the ground, both Russia and Ukraine have been facing their own set of challenges in this war of attrition. For Ukraine, the nation's manpower shortage has led to a vicious cycle of new recruits being fast-tracked to the front lines, who are then much more likely to suffer casualties as a result of being undertrained. Recruit training time is now down to just 6 weeks, and as Ukraine is trying to protect its younger generation, many of those being drafted are over the age of 45. For context, a US soldier in the army goes through 10 weeks of basic training, which would then be followed by an additional 14 to 16 weeks of infantry training. On top of this, as the tactics on the ground tend to change so rapidly, trainers often find it difficult to keep their teaching material relevant for how the war is currently being conducted. trend. One such change has been Russia's increased reliance on motorbike assaults. The official reasoning behind using motorbikes is that they're easier to hide and maintain. However, the rise of Russian bike assaults has also coincided with reports that the nation appears to be facing a shortage of armored vehicles. Not only have donated weapons such as Javelin rocket launchers made armored vehicles much less effective, but the explosion in drone warfare has made it difficult for armored assets to thrive on the battlefield. When a teenager flying a drone worth a few $1,000s can take out a multi-million-dollar tank, it can be hard to justify the risk. The use of light vehicles such as motorbikes can be very advantageous in a scouting, flanking, or reinforcing role. However, the Russian army has started using them for their blitz-style assaults. Ukraine has also started developing its own motorcycle unit. However, as of May this year, it's still in development. The month of June also had the 2025 NATO summit, which saw leaders from 32 member nations and a handful of partner countries come together to discuss their mutual defense pact. NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was initially founded in 1949, and during the Cold War, it was seen as a powerful check against potential Soviet aggression into Europe. Fast forward to this month, and Russia is still the biggest threat on the menu. At the conclusion of the two-day summit in The Hague, 5 main decisions were made. First, and perhaps the most significant, is that all member states agree to a military spending target of 5% of annual GDP. This target is aimed to be met by 2035, and the 5% specifically includes 3.5% for core military expenditures, like troops and equipment, and 1.5% for defense-related infrastructure. A target of 5% is currently higher than even the highest spenders within the NATO alliance, with the average military spending of all nations being 2.61% as of last year. Even the United States, which recently expanded its defense budget to over $1 trillion last month, was sitting at around 3.2% last year, which just shows how significant such a commitment will be. The second agreed upon point was that Russia is a long-term threat to the alliance. Not exactly controversial, however, this does lead nicely into the third point, which states that any contributions made towards Ukraine will count towards a nation's military spending. In addition, the alliance pledged to continue supporting Ukraine, viewing the nation as a shield protecting the entire alliance. The fourth point was to reaffirm everyone's ironclad commitment to Article 5. Article 5 states that if any other nation starts a war with any of its members, all NATO nations are obliged to immediately declare war on the aggressor. The final point was that the next summit will be held in Turkey, and that the dinner party will be Harry Potter themed. We're joking. For that age group, it'll be disco themed all the way. Before Israel's Operation Rising Lion, America's Operation Midnight Hammer, and Swag's own Operation Touch Grass, Ukraine would launch its own big mission, Operation Spiderweb. Since the start of the war, Russia has launched drone and missile strikes into Ukraine almost continuously. The deadliest weapons in the Russian arsenal are ballistic, cruise, and hypersonic missiles, such as the Iskander, the HK-101, and the Kinzhal. Russia's most effective weapons are delivered by strategic bombers such as the Tu-95s, the Tu-22M3s, and the Tu-160s. With this in mind, the goal of Operation Spiderweb was to destroy or damage as many of these assets as possible, to cripple Russia's ability to continue these strikes. Here's the problem. As the bombers are so valuable and difficult to replace, Russia likes to keep them well away from the Ukrainian border, to protect them behind their other layers of defense. If Ukraine was going to hit these targets, they'd have to do it on the down low. Step 1 was to use Ukrainian operators to get inside Russia and start building a ton of drones. A lot of the components needed can be bought from local hardware stores, or 3D printed from home. Step 2 is to get them to the bomber sites. In this case, the Ukrainians concealed the drones inside hidden compartments within the trucks. They would then hire Russian truckers to drive past Russian air bases, at which point the hatches would open and nearby Ukrainian operatives would start controlling the drones directly. Mark our fucking words, this shit will be in a Call of Duty campaign within the next 5 years. Russia itself has been quiet on the exact number of aircraft hit, but open source intelligence has estimated the damage at around 40 aircraft hit and 10 entirely destroyed. This would mean that the operation took out a third of Russia's bomber force operated by its VKS military arm. The operation wasn't perfect, however, as one of the trucks didn't make it to the target airfield at the time of the attack. Another important note is that Ukraine didn't target any of Russia's Tu-160 aircraft, which seems to be deliberate. The Tu-160s are Russia's nuclear-capable bombers, and so far they've been kept out of the Ukrainian front line. The decision to not target them was essentially to send a message: you keep these aircraft out of the war and we won't consider them hostile. However, since the attack, Russia has begun deploying the Tu-160s to Ukraine, which would make them fair game for a subsequent attack. However, considering their enormous cost and very limited number, Russia will likely still consider them too valuable to risk in any meaningful capacity. Ukraine has long pioneered this new age of terrifying drone warfare, and this latest attack was notably an operation kept secret from the United States and potentially its other allies. Weapons from the US and other allies have notably come with strings attached on how and where they're allowed to be used. This is why Ukraine has long been developing its own weapons industry to rid itself of these restrictions. Operation Spiderweb is the latest reminder of Ukraine's ability to launch strikes deep into Russian territory, and the terrifying damage that even rudimentary drones can inflict. Viewers can get excited for our next installment of man-made horrors beyond our comprehension next month. The news is over, but that doesn't mean you need to wait around for another month. Our second channel, Sir Swag Academy, still makes an episode every single week, which lets the team take on much less serious topics.
This guy,
man jorking his dork on a public train bathroom.
No, the legal system of the UK, they couldn't find it in their hearts to be like, this man, he committed a crime.
A link to the channel will be in the description. As always, we also need to show a huge amount of respect for our Patreon supporters who keep the show rolling. Not only has it allowed us to put out the news for the past 6 years without ever missing an episode, but it also lets us go hard on other projects that take a depressingly long time to make. We're just beginning to wrap up videos we started last year, which gives you an idea of how much love and misery goes into what we make. A link to support what we do and get your name in the end credits will be down below. But until next time, we'd like to wish everyone a very happy July. I really like the new TTS. No more AI voices! If you don't have the confidence to present yourself, pay another human to do it, or just don't do YouTube. Yeah, you can tell, it's too digital, it's got that kind of auto-tune quality to it. The cadence is weird, it's too metronomic. The words just run too close together. Makes sense to me. The amount of times you guys say this is a human narrator makes me think that this is still an AI voiceover. The new AI voice still fucks me up. Wow! I haven't watched Sir Swag in a long time, so it kinda caught me off guard with the new AI voice, lol. I miss the OG AI voice. I don't like how good the AI voice has become. It's a little unsettling. Crying, laughing, crying, laughing. Hitler was not accidentally killed by a bunch of interns on training wheels. You are AI and should not spread misinformation.